An HOA built 96 homes on my property. I let them finish construction. Then I ended everything with a single deed. I still remember the exact moment my stomach dropped. I was standing at the edge of what I believed was my quiet, unused land, expecting to see nothing more than open dirt and weeds. Instead, I was staring at an entire neighborhood rising out of the ground. Rows and rows of framed houses stretched into the distance. Cranes swung overhead, and heavy machinery moved with practiced confidence. At first, I honestly thought I had made a wrong turn. I pulled out my phone, checked my location, and even compared the surroundings to old photos I had taken years earlier. There was no mistake. This was my land. Confusion quickly turned into disbelief. I had owned this property for years, paid taxes on it without missing a single deadline, and kept every document neatly stored away. It wasn't land I visited often, but it was land I knew intimately on paper, every boundary, every corner, every survey marker. Yet here was an HOA development in full swing, as if my ownership simply didn't exist. The workers didn't hesitate. The supervisors didn't question anything. And the pace of construction suggested this project had been planned for a long time. I approached the site cautiously, asking a nearby foreman what was being built and who owned the land. He barely looked at me before casually mentioning the HOA and the development company behind it, as if that answered everything. When I told him the land belonged to me, he chuckled politely, clearly assuming I was confused or exaggerating. He suggested I take it up with the HOA office, and went right back to work. That reaction bothered me more than the construction itself. No one stops building unless they absolutely certain they in the right. That night, I went home and pulled out every document I had. The deed, the original purchase agreement, tax receipts, and the professionally done land survey were all exactly as I remembered. The property lines clearly showed the land under construction was mine. There was no overlap, no ambiguity, no loophole. On paper, the situation was black and white. In reality, though, it felt surreal. How could an entire HOA move forward with such a massive project without confirming ownership? Over the next few days, I drove by repeatedly, watching foundations being poured and walls going up. With each visit, my shock slowly transformed into something colder and more deliberate. This wasn't a simple misunderstanding. It was a colossal assumption backed by arrogance. Someone, somewhere, had either ignored the facts or believed they were untouchable. Standing there, watching my land disappear under concrete and timber, I realized this wasn't just about property anymore. It was about power, entitlement, and the dangerous confidence that comes from thinking no one will push back. By the time I left the site that final afternoon, one thought was crystal clear. They had no idea who actually owned the ground beneath their feet. And when the truth finally surfaced, it wasn't going to be a small problem, it was going to be catastrophic. Once the initial shock wore off, I did what any reasonable landowner would do. I tried to resolve the situation quietly. I didn't show up angry or make a scene at the construction site. Instead, I gathered my documents, made copies of my deed and survey, and reached out to the HOA through the proper channels. I assumed there had been some clerical error, a bad map, or a lazy title check. Surely, once they saw the paperwork, everything would stop and we'd sort it out like adults. That assumption didn't last long. My first email went unanswered. The second received a short, dismissive reply telling me the land in question had already been legally acquired as part of the development. No explanation, no proof, no invitation to discuss it further. When I asked for documentation supporting their claim, the response was silence. It was as if they had decided that ignoring me was easier than acknowledging a problem they didn't want to face. I eventually managed to speak to an HOA representative over the phone. The tone of the conversation said everything. There was no concern, no curiosity, not even basic courtesy. I was talked down to, as though I were an inconvenience rather than someone claiming ownership of the very ground they were building on. They told me, confidently, that the project had already been approved. Permits were issued, and construction was too far along to be questioned. The unspoken message was clear. Even if I thought I had a claim, It was too late. What stunned me most was the arrogance. They weren't asking whether I might be right. They were assuming I was wrong. I was told that large developments like this didn't happen by accident. That people like me often misunderstood boundary lines, and that I should probably get a lawyer if I insisted on pushing the issue. It wasn't a warning, it was a dare. I didn't stop there. I sent certified letters, attached clear copies of my deed, and even included the original land survey showing the exact boundaries. Weeks passed, and construction didn't slow for a second. In fact, it sped up. New houses went up almost daily, as if the HOA was racing against time, trying to cement their claim in wood and concrete before anyone could interfere. Each ignored letter and unanswered call made their strategy obvious. Build first, argue later. Standing on the sidelines, watching them laugh off my warnings, I realized something important. They believed momentum was on their side. They thought that once enough money was poured into the project, no court would dare undo it. That belief gave them confidence, but it also blinded them. They mistook my calm persistence for weakness and my silence for surrender. By the end of that phase, I understood exactly what I was dealing with. This wasn't a mistake anymore, it was deliberate dismissal. And in that moment, I stopped trying to convince them they were wrong. Instead, I began thinking about what would happen when they finally realized just how wrong they were. After weeks of being ignored, something shifted inside me. I realized that continuing to argue with the HOA was pointless. They weren't interested in facts, documents, or reason. They were relying on pressure and intimidation, assuming I would eventually give up. That's when I made a decision that surprised even me. I stopped contacting them altogether. No more emails, no more calls, no more warnings. From their perspective, I had gone quiet, and that silence worked exactly as I expected it to. While they continued building, I started preparing. I met with a property attorney who specialized in land disputes and large developments. I laid out every document I had, from the original deed to the most recent tax records. The attorney didn't hesitate. According to him, my ownership was solid, and the case was unusually clear. The HOA had either failed to perform a proper title search or knowingly ignored it. Either way, they were standing on extremely thin legal ground. Instead of rushing into court, we took our time. We double-checked surveys, hired an independent land assessor, and gathered photographic evidence showing the construction progress over time. Every new foundation poured, every roof installed, and every road paved was carefully documented. The more they built, the stronger my position became. Their investment on my land wasn't protecting them, it was increasing their exposure. What made this phase almost surreal was watching the HOA's confidence grow. From the outside, it looked like they had won. Sales signs appeared, marketing materials went up, and future homeowners toured the site, imagining their lives in houses that technically didn't belong where they stood. The HOA board strutted the day we finally stepped into the courtroom felt almost unreal. After months of preparation, silence, and careful documentation, everything came down to this moment. The HOA representatives walked in first, confident and relaxed, surrounded by lawyers who looked equally assured. Their body language said they expected a routine hearing, maybe a negotiation or a minor setback at worst. From their perspective, they had permits, approvals, and nearly 100 completed homes behind them. They believed the scale of the project alone would protect them. When my case was called, I stood up calmly, carrying a simple folder that looked almost insignificant compared to the stacks of binders on the other side. The judge began by reviewing the basic claims. The HOA's attorney spoke first, confidently outlining how the development had progressed, how much money had been invested, and how disruptive it would be to challenge the project now. The argument wasn't about ownership as much as it was about inconvenience. They leaned heavily on the idea that it was too late to change anything. Then it was my turn. My attorney didn't raise his voice or dramatize the moment. He simply asked the judge for permission to present the property records. I handed over the deed, the original survey, tax payment history, and the independent assessments we had gathered. One by one, the documents were examined. The room grew noticeably quieter. The judge leaned forward, flipping through pages slowly. Carefully. Each boundary line matched perfectly. Each record confirmed the same truth. The land under those houses belonged to me. For the first time, I saw uncertainty flicker across the HOA board members' faces. Their confident expressions cracked as the judge began asking pointed questions. Where was their title search? Why did their documents stop short of clearly proving ownership? Why did none of their paperwork directly contradict mine? Their lawyer stumbled, offering vague explanations about assumptions, development timelines, and third-party contractors. None of it addressed the core issue. The moment everything changed was when the judge looked up and stated, plainly, that ownership was not determined by how much had been built, but by who legally held the deed. That sentence hit the room like a shockwave. The HOA members froze. One of them whispered something urgently to their attorney. Another stared straight ahead, pale and rigid. They finally understood what they had dismissed for months. By the time the hearing concluded, the outcome was clear. The court recognized my ownership and ruled that the HOA had built without legal right to the land. The judge didn't appear angry, just firm. This wasn't a gray area or a complicated loophole. It was a straightforward failure to respect property law. As we left the courtroom, the confidence I had seen earlier was completely gone. In its place was panic, disbelief, and the sudden realization that their entire project rested on a foundation they never owned. The silence that followed was louder than any argument they had made before. The aftermath was far more devastating than anything the HOA had imagined. Once the court ruling became official, the illusion holding the entire development together collapsed overnight. Construction stopped immediately. Contractors walked off the site. Suppliers froze deliveries. And banks began asking questions the HOA could no longer answer. What had once been marketed as a prestigious new community suddenly became a legal and financial nightmare. The HOA board scrambled to contain the damage, but there was no clean exit. Nearly all of the 96 homes were finished or close to it, yet none of them legally belonged where they stood. Prospective buyers backed out as soon as the news spread, and existing contracts were canceled one after another. Realtors stopped returning calls. For sale. Signs went up, only to be quietly removed when it became clear that selling homes built on disputed land was impossible. The neighborhood went from buzzing activity to eerie silence in a matter of weeks. Internally, the HOA began to fracture. Board members blamed each other, pointing fingers over who approved the land, who skipped the title check, and who ignored the early warnings. Emergency meetings were held behind closed doors, but nothing they discussed could undo the court's decision. Lawyers advised damage control, yet even that came with staggering costs. Legal fees piled up rapidly, draining the HOA's reserves and forcing special assessments that homeowners, many of whom hadn't even moved in yet, refused to pay. The reputational damage was just as severe. Word traveled fast, and the HOA's name became synonymous with incompetence and arrogance. Developers distanced themselves, partners pulled out, and future projects quietly disappeared. What once looked like an unstoppable expansion turned into a cautionary tale shared among real estate professionals and legal circles alike. No one wanted to be associated with a group that had managed to build an entire neighborhood on land they didn't own. As for me, the experience was both exhausting and sobering. I didn't celebrate the fallout, but I didn't regret standing my ground either. The outcome wasn't about revenge, it was about accountability. The HOA had every opportunity to stop, verify the facts, and correct their mistake. They chose not to. Instead, they relied on power, momentum, and the belief that money could override the law. In the end, the court ruling reaffirmed something fundamental. Ownership matters, and arrogance doesn't replace legality. The land was still mine, just as it had always been on paper. What changed was the lesson everyone involved learned far too late. Building on something you don't own, whether land, authority, or truth, eventually leads to collapse. If you enjoy real stories where entitlement meets consequences, make sure you subscribe. New HOA and real-life justice stories are posted regularly, and you won't want to miss what happens next.